commented on is that societies tend, and people tend, to shift from one extreme to another. That's how it works. Right? Meaning, one culture to another, one extreme to another, one philosophy to another. And sometimes people will switch. They'll see that one particular philosophy or one particular outlook doesn't work, so they switch to another one, but it's normally an extreme. Right? And it's normally done in very, very sort of black and white ways. Right? Now this is not everyone, and of course many, many exceptions, but we find this very, very prevalent. People find it very hard to sort of achieve a bit of balance. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, if you're reading anything about American politics, I don't talk politics, I'm not getting involved in what's right and what's wrong, but I just find it fascinating that, particularly in America now, for example, where it's become very, very extreme. So the left, the administration can do nothing right. Absolutely nothing right. If you're on the right, the administration can do nothing wrong. It's like an amazing thing. Like if you, depends what news outlet you watch. If you're watching Fox News, Trump is a tzaddik. Like, he never does anything wrong. Right? If you're watching CNN, he's an evil person, does nothing right. It's actually quite bizarre. People actually are thinking, like, nothing's all right or all bad or all good. It doesn't work like that. On any side, it doesn't matter what side of politics you're on. Incidentally, on that note, and that's a sort of a side issue, and again, like I don't normally talk politics thing. It was just interesting. It happened recently. I think it was UIA. I think it was right. They brought out Alan Dershowitz. And I'm actually very, very impressed with him because he's a Democrat on the left. He has certain policies which I certainly don't agree with, either because I don't agree with them or because I don't believe they're consistent with Torah values. But what I really liked about him was he's one of the few people I've actually heard that are really, really balanced. Like, he's a Democrat, but he's okay to criticize the left. He's okay with Israel. He thinks. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's a very, but it's something you often don't find for some reason. Parenting is another example. Like, parenting has shifted tremendously. Education and parenting, where it used to be sort of a very much a culture of authoritarian rule and sort of really, really forceful authority. You know, in the old days, like kids are supposed to be seen and not heard or something, and all that kind of stuff, right? And obviously, in schools they would use the cane and beat kids up, and obviously it was very, very ineffective. So they needed to change. So what do? They changed it to the opposite extreme. They went to a complete culture of permissiveness, where it's just an absolute disaster, right? And it's not working. It's clearly not working. I mean, it's another topic, and it's a nice discussion, but it's not working. Come to Penny Casey. You have personalities of people. Some people are very ambitious, but ambitious to the extreme. Some people are very laid back to the extreme. There's just not a lot of balance, right? And then part of that is when people do subscribe to a particular philosophy, a particular outlook, they find it very difficult not only to embrace a balance, not only to embrace something that belongs to a different outlook, but it's difficult for them to even to entertain that there might be some right in something else as well, right? So they might have a particular personality, they might have a particular outlook, a particular way of doing things, a particular attitude, but there's no even, some people find it even very difficult to entertain that maybe an attitude of someone else might have some right in it as well, that maybe is different to mine. Maybe my neighbor also right, but maybe they're also right? You know, that's the famous story I've told you many times, I think, about the shtetl, when two people came for a din Torah, a sort of court case to a rabbi, and Rebbitzin was behind the door and listening to what's going on, and she heard the rabbi say to the one guy, "You're right," and then he turns to the other guy and says, "What's your claim?" He kisses his claim, he says, "You're also right." So after she said to him, what was that all about? How can both people be right? It's impossible. He says, "You're also right." But people just become very boxed in. That's what it seems. People find it very, very boxed in, normally to an extreme, quite a black and white sort of pathway, and very difficult to get out of that. Right? Another interesting example is like we've come from a culture of extreme responsibility, where you know, like nowadays we live in a culture where rights, everyone is very into rights, and it's become almost a very victim sort of society in a way. A society of entitlement. I think we live in a society of entitlement, which is a reaction to when people weren't treated properly, and people were mistreated. The rights of human rights or basic rights of people weren't properly detained, weren't properly taken care of, which was very bad. And now people have gone to the other extreme, where now people are entitled to everything. where there's a very weak work ethic. Often there's a very weak sense of responsibility. Kids are growing up very, very entitled. So it's again one extreme to another. It's a society of a pendulum, both in a sort of cultural, global, community-based idea, and also true with the individual as well. What I want to try and explore is, why is balance so hard to achieve? And what does actually balance mean, right? And how do we achieve it? Those are the three things that I want to try and achieve. Well, because what we do need to understand is that, and to start off with the introduction, is that balance is critical. The way God designed the world, the way effective living has to play out, there actually has to be an ability to embrace opposites. There has to be an ability to embrace different viewpoints and different mindsets. Because if we lock ourselves into one mindset, there will be parts of our human experience that are impossible to engage with any level of effectiveness and success. So balance is actually a critical attribute. It's a critical thing to try and understand and try and embrace. We need to understand what is it and why is it so difficult to achieve. So let me take you down a little bit of a Kabbalistic perspective. Something we've touched upon before, but let me just explain it a bit, particularly those people who perhaps haven't been here before. We know that fundamental to Jewish belief is the creation of the world by God. And part of that belief is that God himself is infinite, undefined, and yet desired and wanted to create a world that is a world of definition. Meaning a world that has definitions, a world that is limited, a world where things fit into boxes and things fit into various different definitions. And therefore, by his design, he created a fragmented world. Right? A world of fragmentation, a world where there's many, many different boxes. And therefore what happens is, people often see the world as a series of different experiences, different philosophies, different fragmented viewpoints and attitudes and perspectives and experiences, and somehow think or feel the need to fit into one or another box. And therefore, you fit into one particular fragment, one particular definition, it becomes very, very difficult to abandon that box, so to speak, and to get into another box, or to manage two boxes at the same time. I'm just making it very, very simple so we understand it properly, right? Now, very, very much, this is the model which we've talked about many, many times. I'll just explain it again. The concept of the chesed and gvura, right? In other words, the concept of sfirot. Just Kabbalah teaches us the following, that God is undefined, God transcends all form of definition. In fact, when Moses was standing at the burning bush and God sent him to Egypt to redeem the Jewish people, he said to God, when I come to Egypt and I tell them that God has sent me, they're going to ask me, who is this God and what is his name? And God said, I cannot tell you my name because I don't have a name. What does that mean? So Kabbalah explains, because although we do have names of God, which I'll explain in a moment, but he said, I cannot tell you my name because I'm above description. A name, the Talmud tells us, describes. A name defines. A name represents something. Each name represents a different concept. Right? In fact, people are called different names in Hebrew because the names Kabbalistically relate and are connected to the nature of our soul, really. Right? Now, we don't always know what that connection is, and the Zohar tells us that parents are given some sort of divine inspiration when they name their children, because that's the name that's meant for that child, and so on and so forth. But names describe a particular type of soul. Doesn't mean we can't change, we could change, we can grow, but name means that I have a certain disposition, and a name therefore is a description. And God says, I have no description, I'm above all definition, I'm above all description. I'm totally infinite and transcendent and omnipotent and omnipresent. However, God says, what I can tell you is it really depends what I'm doing. In other words, I have many names, therefore. The reason why I have many names is because when I choose to manifest myself in a particular way, so I'm called with this name. So when I go to war, when I'm punishing people, my name is Elokim. When I'm being compassionate or I'm being kind, my name is something different, right? And therefore we have a series of 7 names of God, which we are taught in the Chumash, that there are 7 holy names of God, because it all depends what he's doing at the time, right? The 2 main ones which we use always is Hashem and Elokeinu, right? What does that mean? It means that God transcends the whole concept of definition. However, he can be manifested in definition if he wants to. Right? I think I've shared with you once, there was a Kabbalist called the Avodat HaKodesh, and he made a very interesting statement. He said that when we say God is infinite, we have to say, he said, that God possesses both the power to be infinite and the power to be finite, if he wants to. The reason for that is because if we say God is only infinite and not finite, we just made him finite. You get that? Because finite means he's something and not something else. So to be truly infinite means that he can be finite if he wants to be. So God in his essence is truly infinite and therefore transcends all form of definition. But because of that, because he's truly infinite, he also possesses the ability to create definitions within himself if he wants to. And therefore we have in Kabbalah this concept of sfirot. Sfirot means that God chose 10 definitions, 3 intellectual, 7 emotional. The emotional ones are governed, just for the sake of this discussion, to keep it simple, are governed by 2 primary forces, the right and the left, chesed and gvura. Chesed is the giving, the connecting, the loving, the flexible, the expansion, whereas gvura is the holding back, the discipline, the hiding, etc., etc. Right? So God chose definitions and he created a world which are an outcome of those divine definitions which he created. I'm going into this because it's important to understand this, why it's so difficult for human beings to be undefined. Right? So therefore the world is a world of definitions. In fact, that's integral even to the very makeup of the physical creations of the world. Each creation, for example, fire and water, we know is an outcome, an evolution, so to speak, of God's divine definitions. We know that water is the concept of chesed, fire is the idea of gevura, right? And so on and so forth. So therefore, part of that model, therefore, is that each definition is seen independently. When we look at the world, we see superficially a fragmented world where every definition, every box, every experience, every defined process is separate from the other. Are we making sense so far? If I don't, I'll just blame it on jet lag. Now, part of that is this, you see. To be undefined, because what this is really all about is that part of the human growth experience is to learn to become undefined. Right? You see, what happens is that the fragmentation of the world is so strong that we also fragmented. Our personalities are fragmented. My personality is different to your personality. My disposition is different to your disposition. Right? And therefore, we tend to be very stuck in that one definition, that one context that we are created in. Now, part of the human growth, fundamental to human growth, is the concept of learning to become undefined. Learning not to be bound by the things that have shaped us, by the experiences that have shaped us and have given us a particular definition. But being undefined is godly. Because being undefined means tapping into the godliness which is within us. Right? In other words, it's the godliness which is within us that frees us not to be boxed in, not to be stuck, but to go beyond our created definition, to go beyond the box in which we are created or in which we chose to put ourselves in. And that's a difficult thing to do. Because to tap into our godliness, which we all contain, we all possess, needs work. Why? Because part of that, and I'm giving you the Kabbalistic perspective here, part of that process of God creating a world of boxes, to put it simply, a world of fragments, a world where everything is defined in different fragments, different isolated, independent experiences and definitions, is that each definition is completely independent and isolated from the other, and therefore what you don't see is the unity. What you don't see is the creative force which is behind all those definitions. Because in truth, right, there should be no problem for the definitions to integrate. Why? Because all the definitions, all the different sfirot, the chesed and the gvura and all the other fragments of creation, really all come from one source. It all comes from God's undefined power. And because he's truly infinite and truly undefined, he's able to create definitions as well. Are we okay so far? Yeah? But we don't see that. Part of the creation of fragmentation is that we don't see the creative source, the undefined source, the infinite source that is behind all these fragmentations, behind all these definitions. And if we just see them as separate experiences and feel the need to fit into one or the other, and we don't see the possibility, naturally by default, we don't always connect to the ability of integrating the two. And how we integrate the two is by understanding that really it's all part of one experience, all part of one creation. It's all part of God's creation. And therefore, the chesed and the gevurah don't have to contradict. The chesed and the gevurah don't have to conflict. The chesed and the gevurah can come together, they can integrate. You can have either chesed or chesed one day, gevurah the next day, chesed in one experience, gevurah another experience, or you can have chesed and gevurah come together and become one. Why? Because it's all from the same source. I don't know where I said this recently, so I'm apologizing. It was recently in this. I often do that. I say things and I forget where I say them. So apologies if I just mentioned this a few weeks ago. But we had a couple of weeks breaks. That's not so serious. There's a line which we all are very, very familiar with, which comes at the end of Kaddish. Oseh shalom bimramav. Right? Did I say it? Yes, no. Right? We are Oseh shalom aleinu. We say God makes peace in the heavens above. We say Oseh shalom above. He who makes peace on high, Yaseh shalom aleinu, should make peace for us. Right? What does that mean? What politics is there in heaven that God needs to make peace? Right? I mean, politics here we understand, but up in heaven, what's the conflict? What's the peace necessity? So the Kabbalah explains this interesting thing that when God created angels, He also created them very defined. In a holy context, spiritual beings, but very defined. There are angels of fire, there are angels of water, there are angels of love, there are angels of fear. The well-known angel that talks about is the Malach of Chesed is Michael. The one of Gevurah is Gabriel, right? Comes to the word Gevurah. And superficially they seem to conflict. But as God brings them together and He makes them aware of the fact that they were both created by the same God, and they're both really just manifestations of the same infinite, powerful, creative power, that's Oseh shalom bimramav. It makes peace, because what becomes revealed, what becomes apparent, what becomes obvious is that there is no conflict, because the chesed and the gevurah is all part of one experience. It's all part of one God, one creation. So what we ask God at the end of Kaddish is that Oseh shalom bimramav, just like you do that in the spiritual heavens, or Yaseh shalom aleinu, should help us do the same thing here. Should help us make peace as well. Peace between people of different personalities, peace between different perspectives, peace within ourselves, actually. Yaseh shalom aleinu doesn't only mean to make peace among us, that we should get on with each other, but we should be able to get on within ourselves. In other words, we're able to bring together the different forces within ourselves. Right? Because by nature, children, for example, right? If you have a look at children also, we find this is very, very strong. Their emotions are incredibly defined. They just go from one to another, but it's always very extreme, right? Children are either very, 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 very upset, and the whole world has come to an end, or 2 minutes later they're very, very, very happy. But there's no balance whatsoever, right? Now, some of us don't grow out of this very well, but well, we're supposed to, right? That's the idea. That's part of growth. Now, in children, that's fine, because one of the reasons it's fine in children is because children are supposed to discover their emotions and nurture them and identify them and become aware of them. And the way that happens is by each one operating in an extreme, which is fine. That's great. It's just later on we're supposed to learn to bring them together. Right? And that's difficult, because bringing them together means that we actually have to understand the source of how to bring them together. And how does that work? So another thing just to bear in mind is this also, because we see each fragment separately, there's also a concept here of egocentricity. Let me explain this also. It's very, very important to understand. Often when we react to something, right? Let's take our emotional makeup. Why do we react? We talked about this last time. Why do we react irrationally? So there's two reasons. First of all, we get very stuck in our own personality. And second of all, there's a certain subtle, it can be subtle, it doesn't have to be extreme, but it can be even subtle, with a certain sense of ego. In other words, most emotions, as we've talked about many, many times, the definition of our own emotions is how we react to the world, right? We've talked about this. Intellect is how we absorb the world. In other words, it's an outside-in model, whereas emotions are how we react to the world. So most human experiences are our reactions, our responses to the outside stimulus, right? Most of the time what happens is we react to the world around us through the paradigm of our own personality. It's us who's reacting. And therefore often, even though we have the ability to respond differently, we don't, because we're reacting from who we are, and we're stuck in ourselves. Right? We're stuck in our own definition. So part of that process of learning to integrate the definitions, part of that process of learning to achieve balance, is also learning to manage our own ego. And you'll see in a moment what that means. In other words, it's the ability to leave ourselves a little bit. Right? And that goes back to what I said before, because what happens is that really, from a spiritual point of view, it's learning to focus less on ourselves and more on the source of creation. More on the godly power that's behind everything, where things can come together. And when we do that, to recognize the godly power, to recognize that divine creative power that's behind everything, it requires us to leave ourselves a little bit, and to leave our own paradigm a little bit, so we can see a different perspective, we can see the truth. And that's a difficult thing to do, because part of the definition creation that God put into practice is that each definition only feels itself. And that's where the ego comes into it, and we're very, very stuck. And we are. When I talk about ego, by the way, it's not always negative arrogance. It's not always haughtiness. It's not always annoying, just sense of self. A sense of self where we're a little bit stuck in who we are, and we find it a bit hard to look at something different. Which means often we actually think that we're really pursuing a noble goal. We do this with children, for example, very often. Right? Sometimes, that King Solomon said in education, for example, in parenting, it's a great example, where you have to parent every child differently. Maybe the same set of values, but you've got to parent each child differently. Why? Because, like King Solomon said, "Chanoch lenar al pi darko," educate each child according to his or her way, right? Why? Because each child is different. And sometimes parents find that, well-meaning parents, find that very, very difficult. Why? Because they parent through their own paradigm. They parent through the way they see the world. And the way they see the world in a good way, in a noble way, in a very virtuous way, not a negative way. But that's the way they see the world, and therefore that's what they expect from each child. The challenge is that you can't do that. Because one child needs one model, another child needs a different model. And the other model, the second model, might not be my model. It requires, I always say that parenting is one of the greatest forms of personal growth, because it really requires a shift from who I am to be able to see a different way forward. So this is where we have this concept, which we bring in now, called Tiferet, right? We've talked about this before. So in the Sfirot, in the various definitions that God created, it works on right and left, the Chesed and Gvura, right? Fire and water and so on. But there's a concept which God also instilled into the creation called the middle line. The middle line. And in the primary set of emotions, when we talk about Chesed and Gvura, the middle line is the concept of Tiferet, right? In the Sfirot. There's a Kabbalistic idea of Tiferet. What is Tiferet? Here's a very interesting thing. If you look in the Kabbalistic works, Tiferet, by the way, by default, is what most people don't have. Right? We can have it. Most of us vacillate between Chesed and Gvura, or we are disposed to Chesed or to Gvura. But Tiferet is, we could access it, we just need to work on it. So if you look in Kabbalah, you'll see that the word Tiferet has different translations. It's sometimes called balance, sometimes called truth, harmony, beauty, compassion, and empathy. Right? Those are the various translations you get for Tiferet. Now what does all that mean? Why can you have so many translations of one word? So as we've talked many, many times, what Tiferet is the ability. Let's start with truth. The first ingredient to achieve a sense of balance is to move away from self and to look for the truth. That's why Tiferet is truth, right? What do I mean? In other words, when I react to something, I am reacting to something. It's me. So if I react to a child, for example, inappropriately, I get frustrated when I shouldn't get frustrated. I'm unkind when I shouldn't be unkind, or I'm kind when I should be kind, when I shouldn't be kind. Right? Often that happens. People are kind when they shouldn't be, and it's inappropriate, misplaced kindness, especially to children, when we often do that and we spoil them. Why do we do that? Because we're stuck in a particular definition. Maybe I'm a kind person, maybe I'm a weak person, whatever the case is. And therefore I respond to the situation from my paradigm. What does that mean? In other words, the response, can you not see that?
Yellow.
So yellow is compassion.
Thank you.
Sorry, I try to get fancy today with design PowerPoint, but it's not always so effective. Right? Right? So I'm responding from my world. Tiferet means to respond what's needed, not what I want to do, but what's required, what's the right thing to do, what the effective thing is, what the most appropriate and effective result I will be able to achieve. And sometimes that's very difficult. For example, that might mean saying no when I want to say yes, or it might mean a compromise, or it might mean a completely different alternative, a creative idea. It might mean negotiating a middle ground. But why that's so difficult is because it means two things. It means moving away from my box, moving away from my paradigm. It also means moving away from myself, from my own ego. It means responding, which the definition of an emotion means to respond, how we respond to the world. But normally it's how I respond to the world, meaning how I respond to the world from my reality, from my paradigm, from my perspective. And it means moving away from that rather to understand and to look and to discover what is needed, not what I want to do. Is that clear? Right? This is on all levels, by the way. We've talked about this before in communication. Right? The two types of communication, two types of people that speak. Often we speak, we're just projecting and broadcasting ourselves. That's not real communication, not human communication anyway. Right? We've talked about this many times. You get sometimes to an extreme. You get someone who stands up in front of an audience and just talks and talks and has absolutely no clue. People are listening and not listening, are liking it, not liking it, no idea, right? They haven't tapped into it at all. Right? That's an extreme. Why? Because it's a broadcast of self. Very passionate. It could be even good things, just not appropriate for this audience, let's say. Right? Whereas other people might say, well, no, I'm going to modify what I'm saying, or I'm going to change, or I'm not going to talk or communicate the way I want to communicate because I'm looking at what is needed. I'm looking at what is right. I'm looking at what is moral. I'm looking at what is effective. That means moving away from me in order to achieve that balance. It's like the analogy I've given you many, many times to explain Tiferet. Right? And again, it's a very simplified analogy, and I know obviously it depends on the situation, etc., etc. But it's just an analogy I've given you many times, but it's you walk in the street and you see a homeless person asking you for money. Right? So the chesed person just can't say no, so they give them money. The gevurah person thinks they're going to use the money for inappropriate purchases, so they don't give them anything. Right? Both are responding from their world. The tiferet person says, it's nothing to do with what I feel. Let me look at the situation. Let me look at what's right. So he tells the person, look, I won't give you money, but I can see you're hungry. Let's go across to the store and I'll buy you a sandwich. Right? Again, a simplified analogy. Why is that tiferet? Because it's a balance between chesed and gevurah. In fact, it's not a balance. It's not a bit of chesed and a bit of gevurah. You see, some people make a mistake to think that tiferet means that balance means a bit of this and a bit of that, like a diluted form of both. It doesn't have to be that. Chesed, tiferet can mean a complete combination of both. In other words, chesed means I've really got compassion, I'm kind, I want to help this person out, we do not want to leave this person unhelped. On the other hand, I'm able to say no, I'm able to put boundaries on that chesed because I know I want to do it in a way where it will be good for the person. But what's amazing is that often what happens is that when we explore the middle line of Tiferet, right, we actually end up achieving what we wanted to achieve in the beginning. Let's take this analogy. Let's say I'm a chesed person. And I want to help, I can't bear to see this person not being helped. So I'll just give them money. It's very, very possible that I actually ended up not helping them. I ended up harming them. Same thing with children, when we overgive. Right? We spoil. Why? Because we ended up actually hurting them. When I look, why? Because I'm looking at it from who I am. I'm not actually focused on the person. I'm not focused on the recipient. I'm focused on me. And if I do what I need to do, but it didn't help. When you explore Tiferet, you go down the middle line, what's actually happening is I end up doing chesed. Because of the gevura, I end up doing chesed. In other words, I end up helping that person. Much, much more than if I would just respond from my pure right side, for example. And I help myself, because I gave, and I worked on myself, and I became a better person. The gevura person just says, no, I'm not going to help you. What did he achieve? He didn't help the person is suffering, and didn't help himself either. Because not to help someone to be unkind is detrimental. Life of meaning and purpose only comes from giving. Growth only comes from giving. So the gevura person who's extreme gevura and says, I'm not going to give you anything because I don't want to spoil you, or I don't want to hurt you, again, responding from their own paradigm, doing what they want to do, what they think makes it comfortable for them, is actually not helping themselves either. Because they're making themselves cruel people. So therefore they're not helping the person, they're helping themselves. Tiferet, on the other hand, is what life's all about. Tiferet means finding the right in everything. That's why Tiferet is called truth. Because Tiferet requires understanding not what I want to do, but understanding what is the right thing to do, or what is the right philosophy, or what is the right attitude, what's the moral and proper way to approach something. And it's finding the right in everything. You know, it's interesting that the word for truth in Hebrew is emet. Right? Emet comes from three letters: Aleph, Mem, and Taf. Those three letters is the first letter of the alphabet, the middle letter of the alphabet, and the last letter of the alphabet. Right? Whereas falsehood in Hebrew, sheker, the word for lie, is shin, kuf, resh, are three letters all bunched up together. They're only part of the alphabet. They don't have anything to do with the rest of the alphabet. Why? Because emet means the truth is the ability from the beginning till the end to be able to stick with the truth. Not only when it's convenient. Not only when I want to do something, because that's falsehood. In other words, something that I can only apply sometimes but other times, selective kindness or selective working on myself or selective growth. In other words, this time I respond because I want to, the other time I don't respond because I'm not in the mood or because it's not my personality. That's sheker, that's falsehood, because it only applies part of the time. Emet means the ability to carry it through from beginning to end, that in every situation, no matter what it is, difficult for me, hard for me, easy for me, I'm able to stop, to think, to find the truth, to look at it from objectively, to find what needs to be done, not what I want to do, not to be stuck in myself, in my own box, in my own paradigm, and then to implement it and to respond accordingly. That's Tiferet. So what's that got to do with all the other translations? So obviously because it brings balance, right? So truth brings balance. Because truth means that I don't only stick to chesed or to gevura, to one personality or another. Truth means I'm able to balance both. Because that is ultimately the ultimate way of living. The ultimate way of living means that God gave us multiple layers of our personality. He gave us multiple attributes. He gave us multiple emotions. We are all structured with the 10 sefirot. We have 3 intellectual powers, 7 emotional powers. And to be a proper and moral and effective person who serves God or who makes ourselves a better person or makes the world a better place and lives a meaningful life requires and means that we have to actualize and use every single part of our personality. Both those parts that we naturally connected to and disposed to, and the parts that we're not naturally, because we need them all. There are times for this, there are times for that. There are times to be ambitious, there are times to take a step back. There are times to be kind, there are times to hold back, there's time to put them both together. And there's a call of the hour where every part of our emotional structure is needed according to the truth of the situation, according to the need of that situation. And that's what a true growing person is, and that comes from accessing the middle. That middle line, when you're talking Kabbalah, is called Kava Emtsai. The Kava Emtsai, which is the middle line which goes all the way down up to the essence of God. In other words, that's the part which, the middle line is where we access that godly power of being undefined, of not being stuck in a definition, but being able to balance or go from one definition to the other or bring them all together. So therefore, it's truth and it's balance. It's also empathy. Why is it empathy? Because that's what empathy is. What is empathy? Empathy means not to be stuck in myself. Empathy means to see the other person, to go beyond myself. Arrogance and empathy don't go together. Ego and empathy don't go together. Empathy means I can just put myself aside a second and see the perspective of the situation, the perspective of the person. Right? Compassion is the same sort of thing. Compassion means I'm able to relate to another person. Compassion, by the way, is different to kindness. Kindness means I just give. Compassion means I actually have compassion on the other person and I see what they need. Right? And that's why it's called harmony and beauty. Harmony because it harmonizes the different extremes together. And beauty because Kabbalah tells us that what's a beautiful garment? The one that is multicolored. Many, many colors. Colors that are beautiful colors. But when colors come together and harmonize together, that creates real beauty. It's like the analogy I've given you often about an orchestra. So one musical instrument on its own is beautiful, but when many, many instruments play together, provided they play in sync and they play following one set of values, following one set of truth, following the conductor, it becomes symphonic, it becomes absolutely beautiful. And that's the idea. The idea is to have those values and to have that sense of focus of leading a meaningful and purposeful life, and then to respond to every situation based on those values, whether they fit into my personality or whether they don't. But it's more focused on the truth rather than who I am.
In practice, Rabbi, this
is very difficult.
In practice, it really requires a lot of pause and thought, because in the moment, whether it's parenting or the beggar, your natural instinct is going to be, okay, I'll give the beggar money, but then that isn't necessarily going to give the right outcome. So like in parenting, I'll give him the lolly, he'll shut up, whatever, but that's spoiling. So my whole thing is you've got to pause then, and it's a whole same practice.
Not only have to pause, but it requires something else. That's what my next point was. Because if you look at let's go back a second, you look at this one doesn't show it so much. Oh. No, that doesn't show the connection one. Sorry, okay. But if you look at the middle, if you look at the Sphirot Kabbalistically, right? So emotionally you got Chesed on the right, Gur on the left, and then Tiferet in the middle, right? If you go a step up, you've got the intellectual triangle, where you have Chochmah on the right, Bin on the left, and Da'at in the middle. And Da'at is that incredible, we've talked about this before, Da'at is that credible, powerful way of thinking, where not just you pause and think, but you internalize the thinking, right? And you really, really understand it well. Not only understand it well, but you're able to look at something properly and dissect it and really see the difference between what is good and what is not good. I'll tell you an amazing thing. In davening, in prayer, we have what's called the Amidah, right? So the weekday Amidah has 19 lessons. Now, on Motzei Shabbat, on Saturday night, in the evening prayer, there's a paragraph in the Amidah which is inserted, an extra paragraph, which is Havdalah. It's a verbal Havdalah, not the Havdalah make on wine, but it's the verbal Havdalah, where we bless God for making the separation between Shabbat and the weekdays, and light and darkness, and so on. Good and evil, right? So we talk about the concept of boundaries and separation. So there's a whole discussion in the Talmud where to put that extra paragraph, right? It's not an extra blessing, it just needs to be included in one of the already existing blessings. So the final opinion which we follow is the opinion which the Talmud says it's got to be in the fourth blessing of the Amidah. Why? The fourth blessing of the Amidah is where we ask God to gift us with intellect and da'at. Right? So the Talmud has a beautiful line. It says, "In ein da'at havdalah minayim." If there's no da'at, then how can you discern? There's no discernment. You can't understand the difference between holy and unholy, darkness and light. Right? So on an emotional level, that center, that key balance comes from the word tiferet, that beauty, that truth. But where is it based on? It's based on that ability to actually think, and think deeply, and think together with a level of what they call discernment. In other words, to actually tell the difference between what is true and what is not true, what is good and what is bad, what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. And that's, sometimes the reason why it's called that is because sometimes you have people who are brilliant academically, but they have no doubt, right? Like, it's an amazing phenomenon. I don't know what it means. Like, it's an incredible thing to watch sometimes. You can have people who are geniuses academically, but complete fools. Right? I never came across people like that. But, right? Why? Because they don't know, they have no clue what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. In other words, the intellect is all theoretical. So when you talk about pausing and thinking, it's not just pausing and thinking on an academic level, it's pausing and thinking with real application, with real ability to understand what is appropriate and what is not. So I think I've shared this with you before, but it's a beautiful idea. Just to show you. So where you see this, we have the kashrut model. You know, an animal. We know in the Torah they talk about what animals are kosher, right? So there are two signs. Sorry, we're playing around with graphics lately. So excuse me. There are two signs of what makes an animal kosher, right? One is it's got to chew the cud. The other one has got to have split hooves, and the split hooves have to be all the way up. There's a beautiful Kabbalistic idea that explains it in the following way. Because every mitzvah has symbolic meaning. It's not just a law. So we talk about we all have an animal. We all have an animal part to us, which is the impulsive part, the emotional part. And the question is, how do we make our animal kosher? So there are two signs that make an animal kosher. One is the idea of chewing the cud. What is chewing the cud? So chewing the cud essentially means that an animal eats the food and regurgitates it and eats it again, right? So Kabbalistically, that's the idea of reflection and review. Always thinking. That's the concept you were talking about before. Making sure to dissect things, to chew them over, to question them. Not to over-question them, but to question them, to have a look at it again, to challenge ourselves, to make sure that we're not coming from a bias, we're not coming from an egocentric perspective, but we actually are really thinking, right? And the second sign is the split hooves. What is the split hooves? And the law is, by the way, that the animals that have split hooves are only kosher if they are split all the way up, and it becomes two different compartments, as you can see over there in the picture, right? Because those two become the right and the left. The commentaries explain refer to chesed and gevurah. In other words, a kosher animal is not someone who only gets locked into one, the right or the left. A kosher animal means that you have and can incorporate, and you can walk with, you can grow with, both sides of our emotional spectrum, chesed and gevurah, because we're going to need both. As we said before, we're going to need every part of our emotional structure to lead a life of meaning and purpose and effectiveness. And that's why the second sign of kashrut is a split hoof where it's got both the right and the left. And just to end off with another interesting idea, we see how deep this goes from this week's parsha. This week's parsha is the famous story of Korach, right? Where Korach rebelled against Moses. Why did he rebel against Moses? Because he was ambitious. There's many, many explanations, but Korach was ambitious. Just to give you a bit of the background, if you're not completely familiar with it, Korach was a Levi, right? And he was related to Moshe Rabbeinu, he was a nephew of Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu's brother, Moses' brother Aaron, was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And Korach said, why can't we all be high priests? Right? The high priest has a very elevated role. The high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, brings incense, has a closeness to God, which most of us don't have. The high priest was a very, very lofty and spiritual and amazing experience. And Moses tells him, you're making a mistake. Because not every role is for everyone. We can all serve God, and we all need to serve God, but not everything everyone does. There are roles, different purposes, different people have different functions. But Korach was so hung up on his ambition to be elevated spiritually, right? Korach was, many commentators explain, was actually a great guy, and he was motivated spiritually. But he made a mistake. Where did the mistake come from? So I saw an amazing insight this week from a commentary I mentioned it on Tuesday, but a beautiful idea. Where the first verse in this week's Torah portion is a very interesting verse. It says, Vayikach Korach, Korach took and he was the son of Yitzhar. His father's name was Yitzhar. His grandfather's name was Kahat, and his great-grandfather's name was Levi. Who, by the way, Levi was the son of Yaakov. Right, Yaakov. And it stops at Levi. But an interesting verse, it says, Korach took, and it doesn't say what he took. It says, it's a very funny grammatical sentence. It says, Vayikach Korach, Korach took, and it doesn't say what. It says, the son of Yitzhar, the son of Kahat, the son of Levi. Right? So there's many, many explanations. It's a different topic, but I saw one explanation that goes like this. Vayikach Korach, Korach took his lineage, as being the son of Yitzhar, the son of Kahat, the son of Levi. But I didn't go further than Levi. Who was Levi? Levi was a son of Yaakov. Now, our patriarchs, we are taught Kabbalistically, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov represents Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferet. That's why there are many, many verses that connect Yaakov with truth. Titain emet le Yaakov. Yaakov is synonymous with truth. Right? So the way our lineage is structured is that God gave us Abraham, who was a model of chesed, hospitality, compassion, and so on. He gave us Yitzchak, which is more disciplined, which is Gevurah. So we see the both models. And then we have Yaakov, who was Tiferet. Interesting enough, by the way, the Kabbalah tells us, interesting, that Abraham Avinu was extreme chesed, and therefore didn't ultimately work completely, and he had a son that wasn't on the program, Ishmael. Right? Yitzchak, same thing. Yitzchak was extreme Gevurah, and he had a son, which was Esau, whereas Yaakov was Tiferet. Tiferet is truth. He's able to see the truth from beginning to end. He had 12 children, they were all 12 tribes, they were all part of the Jewish nation, and they were all holy. Okay? Korach's problem was that he took his lineage very seriously. He came from great people, Yitzhar, Kahat, Levi, but he didn't go further to Yaakov. He didn't take the truth. If Korach would have really examined himself properly, he would have been able to discover. You see, sometimes we talk ourselves into things. This is why that pause, that dart is so important. To achieve the balance and to know when to respond and when to hold back. And when to yes and when to no. Often we talk ourselves into it that we're doing it for good reasons. And we have this conviction, this must be right. Right? And we haven't taken enough depth and enough time to really look deep within ourselves to know, is this the truth? Is this just me? Or is it the truth? Because if Korach really wanted to serve God, he would have done what God wanted him to do, which was to hold back. And understand, not everyone can be a Kohen. But he was spiritually driven, greatly driven. But he missed the Yaakov, he missed the Tiferet, he missed the truth. He didn't look deeply with himself, do I really mean this for me? Or do I mean this because for the ultimate truth? If he would have done that, he wouldn't have gone ahead with his rebellion. And that's what the Pasuk means. Vayikach Korach, Korach took Yitzhar, Kahat, Levi, but he stopped short. He didn't go all the way to Yaakov. Had he gone to Yaakov and had he applied the truth, he wouldn't have done what he did, and therefore he landed up the way he did land up, and he was punished. So that's the general idea of what balance means. Balance means to look at what is needed, not what I need, not what I want. To look what the situation requires, to look what's the right thing, to look at the truth, and to be able to bring together the definitions. It's about accessing that godly spark within us that is above definition, and therefore able to bring the different boxes together and understand that all the boxes are really part of one creative, infinite force. What we're going to try and do the next 3 weeks is translate this and see how this actually plays out in practical examples of the human experience. Have a wonderful week.